Chapter 14. By the end of the week, Luke had a nice plot of land cleared. The raspberry plants were all at the center, and he had straight lines of bean sprouts planted on either side. It was Dad he pretended to appeal to most now. "What do these look like to you, Dad?" he'd say aloud, as though Dad were really there to answer. "Am I just wasting my time, or will I have a good crop come fall?" Luke truly wasn't sure, but he felt so proud looking at his neat little garden. He kept meaning to explore more of the woods, but he was always too busy digging and weeding, tending his plot. Anxiously he shooed away squirrels and chipmunks, and wished that he could stay out and guard his garden all the time. But each afternoon he kept a close eye on the barren watch he now wore on his wrist, so he could run back to the school promptly at 6 o'clock. He'd found the watch in his suitcase and faced quite a chore figuring out how to read it. Those lines and V's and X's on it were numbers, he knew, but different from the ones that he was used to. Why did Barons always have to make everything so fancy and complicated? Back home, Mother and Dad had just a single-digit clock in the kitchen. It blinked off the minutes as clear as could be. This watch was like a foreign language to Luke. But he stared at the angle of the rays of the sun. He studied the digital clocks at school and compared them with the watches on his wrist. Eventually he understood the Baron watch just as well as any other. That made him feel proud, too. So did his next accomplishment. One day at lunch they served baked potatoes in the school dining hall. They were so undercooked they practically crunched. Luke bit into a raw end that hadn't even had its eye removed. Spitting it out, he complained to himself, "I'd rather plant this than eat it." Plant this, of course. How many springs had Luke spent cutting up potatoes for planting? He and Mother perched over a 3-gallon bucket, knives flashing. When he was little, he'd always tried to rest his feet on top of the bucket, the same way Mother did, but he was never tall enough. Even when he was tall enough, he never balanced things right. He'd tip the whole bucket over. Mother would look at him sternly and sigh, "Pick it up." But then she'd smile, like she wasn't really mad. She'd talk to him the whole time they worked. "Careful with this knife, don't cut toward your hand. You're making sure there's an eye in every potato, aren't you? Nothing will grow without an eye." But potatoes would grow without a seed. He just needed a raw potato. Covertly, Luke used his fork to separate the cooked and raw part of his potato. The raw part he dropped into his hand and slipped into his pocket. Probably nobody had ever used Baron pants for transporting potato parts before, but Luke didn't care. As soon as the bell rang for the end of lunch, Luke moved quickly among the tables, grabbing the left-behind potato pieces wherever he could. His pockets were stuffed in a matter of minutes. He walked swiftly down the hall and out the door, trying not to smash the potatoes. Nobody noticed. Out in the woods, Luke dumped out his pockets and examined his treasure. He had 8 potato pieces that looked like good candidates for planting. He wished he'd thought to smuggle a knife out of the dining hall, too, but that couldn't be helped. He halved as many of the potatoes as he could using his fingernails and brute force. Then he planted them in a row beside the beans. When he was done, Luke sat back against a tree trunk and surveyed his work. It looked good. In a few days he'd know if anything was going to grow. He thought the bean sprouts looked bigger. At least they weren't withering yet. After a few minutes of rest, Luke walked down to a creek and ran through the woods and cupped his hands in it, making trip after trip to bring water back for his garden. If only he had one of those 3-gallon buckets now. Even a cup would help. Maybe he could bring one from the dining room. In the meantime, he didn't really mind using his hands. Walking back and forth between the creek and his garden, Luke felt a strange surge of emotion, one he hadn't felt in so long that he'd practically forgotten what it was. Happy, he thought in amazement. "I'm happy."